September 22, 1934, 2 a.m., Gresford Colliery, Wrexham, North Wales. William Bonsall, 43 years old, adjusted his cap lamp and took one last breath of surface air before descending into the cage that would carry him 2,000 feet underground. The night shift, always the hardest, working in darkness above while darkness surrounded you below. Beside him stood his son John, 19 years old, making his usual joke. "Another day in paradise, eh, Dad?" William forced a smile. He'd been making that descent for 26 years. The jokes got old, but the fear never quite did. What William Bonsall didn't know, what none of the 266 men descending into Gresford that night knew, was that 3 days earlier, Deputy Overman John Davies had filed a report about dangerous levels of methane gas accumulating in the Dennis section of the mine. The report had been received, read, and filed by colliery manager Sir Henry Walker. No action had been taken. Davies had been told that production schedules cannot accommodate extended ventilation improvements at this time. The irony was suffocating. Gresford Colliery was considered one of the most modern mines in Britain. Opened in 1908, it boasted electric lighting in main tunnels, mechanical coal cutters, an electric haulage system and extensive ventilation fans. It had never experienced a major disaster. The company United Westminster and Wrexham Collieries frequently cited Gresford as proof that modern mining technology had made coal extraction safe. Mining journals had published articles praising Gresford's safety record and efficient production methods, but beneath that modern surface, familiar problems festered. Gresford extracted coal from the yard seam, a rich deposit of high-quality steam coal that powered British industry and Royal Navy ships. The yard seam was also notoriously gassy. Methane seeped naturally from the coal, accumulating in poorly ventilated areas. The mine's ventilation system, while modern by 1930s standards, was undersized for the mine's expanding layout. As production increased, driven by demand from British industry recovering from the Great Depression, ventilation struggled to keep pace. John Davies, the deputy overman who'd filed the warning, was a careful man. 47 years old, Methodist chapel elder, father of 5, he'd worked at Gresford since it opened. He understood coal mining's dangers intimately. He'd survived the Second-deadliest disaster in 1913, where 439 miners had died. That experience had made him obsessive about safety. His fellow deputies sometimes mocked him as cautious John, but his crews appreciated his vigilance. On September 19, 1934, Davies had been inspecting the Dennis section, a complex of tunnels in the mine's deepest area, when his flame safety lamp showed clear signs of methane. The lamp's flame had developed a blue cap, indicating gas concentrations approaching dangerous levels. Standard procedure required immediate reporting and suspension of work in affected areas until ventilation improved. Davies had followed protocol. He'd reported to colliery manager Sir Henry Walker the same morning. Walker had listened, nodded and said, "Thank you, John, I'll review the matter with the chief engineer." That review never happened. Or if it did, it resulted in no action. Work in the Dennis section continued. Production quotas remained unchanged. The ventilation system received no improvements or adjustments. John Davies knew this because he'd returned to the Dennis section on September 20th and again on September 21st. Each time his lamp showed methane present. Each time he'd reported it. Each time he was told that ventilation improvements were scheduled but couldn't be implemented immediately without disrupting production. On September 22nd, John Davies was not working. He'd requested the night off to attend his daughter's birthday celebration. His replacement for the night shift was Samuel Hughes, a younger deputy with less experience. Hughes would be responsible for safety oversight in the Dennis section, the section where methane had been accumulating for 3 days. William Bonsall and his son John were assigned to the Dennis section that night. Their job was coal extraction, operating pneumatic picks to break coal from the seam face, loading it into trams for transport to the surface. Hard work, dangerous work, but it paid better than surface jobs. William needed the money. His younger daughter was hoping to attend teacher training college, and tuition was expensive. The night shift at Gresford typically employed 270 Nesset 280 men. On September 22, 266 men descended. They were spread across multiple sections of the mine: the Dennis section where William and John Bonsall worked, the Martin section, the Slant, and various maintenance and haulage areas. The mine was a vast underground complex, covering approximately 6 square miles of tunnels and workings extending up to 3 miles from the main shaft. At 2:15 a.m., the night shift was underground and beginning work. On the surface, colliery manager Sir Henry Walker was in his office, completing paperwork. The night supervisor, Thomas Carlyle, manned the control room monitoring the mine's ventilation system and communication lines. Everything appeared normal. What wasn't normal, what nobody on the surface could see, was the methane concentration in the Dennis section. Over 3 days, gas had accumulated in poorly ventilated areas, creating pockets where concentrations exceeded 10%, well into the explosive range. Methane becomes explosively flammable at concentrations between 5% and 15% in air. Below 5%, there's insufficient fuel for combustion. Above 15%, there's insufficient oxygen. But in that middle range, any ignition source, a spark, a flame, a friction spark from metal striking rock, can trigger explosion. The Dennis section, at 2:15 a.m. on September 22, 1934, contained multiple pockets of methane at explosive concentrations. It also contained 87 miners working with electric equipment, pneumatic tools, and flame safety lamps. The combination was catastrophic, waiting to happen. William Bonsall and his son were working approximately 400 yards from the main Dennis Tunnel junction, in a narrow side gallery where the coal seam was particularly rich. The gallery was poorly ventilated. The ventilation current didn't reach this far effectively. William had noticed the stale air when they'd entered, the slight sweet smell that indicated gas. He'd checked his safety lamp. The flame showed a small blue cap, gas present, but not at immediately dangerous levels by the standards of 1934 mining practice. What William didn't know was that not immediately dangerous by 1934 standards meant potentially explosive if conditions changed, and conditions were about to change. At 2:08 a.m., a coal-cutting machine in an adjacent gallery hit a pocket of trapped gas. The sudden release created a small pressure wave that dispersed stagnant air, mixing it with fresh air in just the right proportions. The methane concentration in a 20-foot section of tunnel suddenly shifted from 16% too rich to burn to 8% explosive range. The coal-cutting machine, operated by miner David Thomas, continued running. The machine used electric power, and its motor wasn't explosion-proof. It didn't need to be, because the mine had never experienced a serious gas explosion. The motor's brushes generated small sparks as part of normal operation, usually harmless, but at 2 hours 8 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., one of those sparks occurred in an atmosphere containing 8% methane. The methane ignited instantly. The initial explosion was small, a flash of flame, a sharp crack like a gunshot. David Thomas saw blue flame erupt around his machine, felt a wave of heat, staggered backward. The explosion knocked him down but didn't kill him. For about 2 seconds it seemed like a minor incident, frightening but survivable. Then the secondary explosion occurred. Gresford Colliery, like most deep coal mines, was coated in layers of coal dust. Decades of mining had created a fine black powder that covered every surface: walls, ceilings, floors, timbers, equipment. This dust was the residue of cutting, blasting, and transporting millions of tons of coal through confined spaces. It should have been regularly suppressed with water or stone dust. It wasn't. Water reduced visibility and created mud that slowed production. Stone dusting cost money and required extra labor. So the coal dust accumulated, undisturbed, creating a perfect fuel for disaster. The initial methane explosion lifted coal dust into suspension throughout the Dennis section. For a fraction of a second, the air in multiple tunnels contained a perfect mixture, coal dust particles suspended at explosive concentration. Then the suspended dust ignited. A coal dust explosion is exponentially more powerful than a methane explosion. Each burning particle heats adjacent particles to ignition point. The reaction propagates at supersonic speed, 2,000 feet per second in confined spaces, creating a pressure wave that can reach 300 pounds per square inch. At that pressure, human bodies don't just die, they're destroyed. Steel support beams twist like wire, concrete cracks. Wooden timbers vaporize. The coal dust explosion ripped through the Dennis section in approximately 4 seconds. It traveled along tunnels, turned corners, followed ventilation currents, seeking oxygen and fuel. It reached speeds exceeding Mach 2 in straight tunnel sections. The pressure wave preceded the flame front by microseconds, crushing miners' lungs and rupturing internal organs before the flames consumed them. William Bonsall was 400 yards from the initial methane ignition when the coal dust explosion reached him. He heard a distant rumbling sound. Had time to turn toward it. Time to register confusion. What was that noise? Then the pressure wave hit him like a physical wall. His lungs ruptured from overpressure. He was dead before his brain could process pain. Dead before the flames arrived, half a second later, to incinerate his body. His son John, working 10 feet away, died the same way. Father and son killed simultaneously, their bodies found later side by side, burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by their lamp numbers and position. David Thomas, the miner whose coal-cutting machine had sparked the initial methane ignition, died in the first microsecond of the secondary explosion. He was at the epicenter, where the pressure wave exceeded 400 psi. Death was instantaneous. Every bone in his body fractured simultaneously, internal organs liquefied by the shock wave. The explosion propagated through the Dennis section, the Martin section, and into main haulage tunnels. 87 miners working in these areas died within the first 10 seconds, most from the pressure wave and flames, some from flying debris as the explosion shattered timber supports and equipment. But the disaster was only beginning. The explosion created a massive pressure surge that traveled up the main ventilation shaft, reaching the surface as a blast of hot air and debris that shattered windows in the pithead buildings. Night Supervisor Thomas Carlyle, in the control room, heard a deep boom that shook the building. He looked at his instruments. Ventilation system pressure readings had spiked, then dropped to 0. Electrical power to underground sections had failed. The phone line to the Dennis section was dead. Carlyle knew immediately. Explosion, underground. He triggered the general alarm and called the rescue service. The first indication many people in Wrexham had of disaster was the sound, a deep rumbling boom that rattled windows across the town at 2:09 a.m. Those who knew mining recognized it instantly. Those who didn't thought perhaps it was thunder, or a quarry blast, or some industrial accident. By 2:15 a.m. as word spread, hundreds of people were rushing toward the colliery, wives, mothers, children, anyone with family underground. The explosion had destroyed the main ventilation system and severed power cables throughout the affected sections. Without ventilation, deadly gases began accumulating: carbon monoxide from the explosion's incomplete combustion, carbon dioxide from fires that continued burning underground, and methane continuing to seep from the coal seam. The mine was filling with poison. Rescue operations began at 2:30 a.m. Teams of volunteer rescue workers, trained miners equipped with primitive breathing apparatus, descended into the mine. What they found was hell. The main shaft and primary tunnels were structurally intact, but beyond the first few hundred yards, devastation. Tunnel sections collapsed, support timbers shattered, rails twisted, equipment destroyed, and bodies. Dozens of bodies in the accessible areas, some killed by the explosion, others overcome by gas while trying to escape. The rescue teams could penetrate only a few hundred yards before toxic gas concentrations forced them back. Their breathing apparatus, proto-sets that used compressed oxygen and chemical carbon dioxide absorbers, provided only about 2 hours of breathable air. And the apparatus was primitive by modern standards, uncomfortable, unreliable, prone to failure. Over the first 12 hours, rescue teams made repeated attempts to reach the Dennis section, where the explosion had originated and where most miners had been working. Each attempt was driven back by gas heat or structural instability. By 2 p.m. on September 22, 12 hours after the explosion, no survivors had been found beyond the first few tunnel sections. 6 men had escaped, 6 out of 266 underground. They'd been working in the slant section, relatively distant from the explosion's epicenter. They'd heard the blast, felt the pressure wave, been knocked down by the shock wave, but they'd been far enough away that the pressure wave had dissipated to non-lethal levels by the time it reached them, and the flame front had exhausted itself before reaching their location. These 6 survivors provided crucial testimony about conditions at the time of explosion. All reported noticing gas earlier in the shift. One, a deputy named William Jethro, said he'd reported high gas readings to the surface via telephone around 1:45 a.m., 20 minutes before the explosion. He claimed he'd been told to monitor the situation, but hadn't been authorized to evacuate workers or shut down operations. This testimony would become critical in the subsequent inquiry. If Jethro's account was accurate, colliery management had received real-time warning of dangerous conditions and chosen to continue operations rather than halt production. By the evening of September 22, the scale of disaster was becoming clear. 6 survivors, 260 men still underground. Rescue efforts continuing but hampered by gas and fire. Families gathering at the pithead, waiting for news, most already understanding there would be no good news. Mary Bonsall arrived at the colliery at 3 a.m., having been awakened by a neighbor who'd heard the alarm. She stood at the barriers, watching rescue workers emerge from the shaft, seeing them shake their heads. Her husband William and son John were both underground. She waited, hoping, praying, already grieving. The Gresford disaster wasn't just killing miners underground, it was destroying families on the surface. The 260 men trapped underground included 39 pairs of fathers and sons, 16 sets of brothers, and multiple cases of 3 or more family members from the same household. Some families lost every male wage earner in a single night. Among those waiting at the pithead was Margaret Thomas, wife of David Thomas, the miner whose coal-cutting machine had sparked the initial ignition. She didn't know yet that her husband was at the explosion's epicenter, didn't know that he'd been vaporized in the first microsecond. She waited with the others, hoping against hope. The rescue effort continued through September 22 and into the 23rd. Teams descended repeatedly, pushing deeper into the mine as toxic gas levels slowly decreased. But the fires underground continued burning, fed by exposed coal seams that would smolder for months. The combination of fire, toxic gas, and structural instability made deep penetration impossible. On September 23, rescue workers reached the edge of the Dennis section. What they found ended any hope of survivors. The tunnel was completely collapsed for hundreds of yards. The roof had fallen, crushing everything beneath tons of rock and coal. Behind that collapsed section were 140 miners. No human could have survived the collapse. And even if they had, the toxic gas concentrations beyond the collapse zone were lethal. Carbon monoxide at 8,000 parts per million, 10 times the immediately fatal concentration. The decision facing mine management and rescue coordinators was agonizing. Continue attempting to reach bodies, risking more lives in the attempt, or seal the mine and entomb the dead permanently. On September 26, 4 days after the explosion, colliery manager Sir Henry Walker made the decision. The Dennis and Martin sections would be sealed. Concrete barriers would be erected, sealing off approximately 2 square miles of the mine. 140 bodies would remain underground, forever entombed in the tunnels where they died. The decision was pragmatic but devastating. Families who'd held on to hope that bodies might be recovered for proper burial now faced the reality that their loved ones would never come home, never receive Christian burial, never rest in consecrated ground. 11 bodies were recovered from accessible areas, men who'd died attempting to escape, whose bodies lay in tunnels that could be reached without excessive risk to rescue workers. These 11 received proper funerals. The other 255 remained underground. The official death toll was 266 miners, but the actual human cost was incalculable. 266 deaths created approximately 190 widows and more than 500 fatherless children. In Wrexham, a town of approximately 30,000, hardly a family was untouched. The disaster destroyed the economic foundation of entire communities. Mining villages where every household depended on colliery wages suddenly faced collective poverty. The aftermath brought the usual expressions of sympathy and promises of investigation. King George V sent condolences. King George V sent condolences. The Prime Minister made a statement in Parliament. Mine safety experts were dispatched to examine the site, and on October 15, 1934, 3 weeks after the disaster, a formal inquiry began. The Gresford inquiry, chaired by Sir Henry Walker, no relation to the colliery manager, heard testimony from 112 witnesses over 47 days. The proceedings revealed a pattern of negligence that shocked even observers accustomed to lax mine safety practices. John Davies, the deputy overman who'd filed methane warnings on September 19, 20th, and 21st, testified on October 20th. He brought his written reports, his logbook entries, his documentation of every attempt to get management to address the gas problem. His testimony was damning. "I reported dangerous gas accumulation in the Dennis section on 3 consecutive days. Each time I was told that production schedules didn't allow for extended ventilation work. On the third day, September 21st, the day before the explosion, I told Mr. Walker directly that we were approaching the point where continuing work was criminally negligent. He said, and I quote, 'John, I appreciate your concerns, but we have quotas to meet. We'll address ventilation issues next month during the scheduled maintenance period.'" Davies broke down crying during his testimony. He knew the 260 men who'd died. Many were friends, some were relatives. He'd tried to save them and been overruled by management prioritizing production over safety. Sir Henry Walker, the colliery manager, testified on November 2nd. His defense was familiar. The mine had operated safely for 26 years, safety protocols were followed, the explosion was an unforeseeable accident. When confronted with Davies's warnings, Walker claimed they'd been routine reports that didn't indicate imminent danger. "Deputy overmen report gas regularly," Walker testified. "It's a gassy mine. Gas is always present to some degree. Mr. Davies's reports indicated elevated gas levels but not at immediately dangerous concentrations. We were monitoring the situation and planned to address it during the next maintenance cycle." When asked why the next maintenance cycle was scheduled for October after the explosion, rather than immediately upon receiving warnings, Walker replied, "Shutting down sections for ventilation work affects production significantly. We have contractual obligations to our customers. The coal we produce powers British industry. We can't shut down every time a deputy detects slightly elevated gas levels." The inquiry's key question became what constituted immediately dangerous gas levels. Davies had reported methane concentrations that by 1934 standards were elevated but not yet in the explosive range at the time of his inspections. The gas had been accumulating, approaching dangerous levels, but hadn't yet crossed the threshold that would mandate immediate shutdown. This created a legal grey area. The colliery had followed the letter of safety regulations. Work was suspended when gas reached mandated shutdown levels. But Davies's point was that by the time gas reached those mandated levels, it was often too late. The regulations were inadequate, written to minimize production disruption rather than maximize safety. The inquiry heard from mining engineers who testified that Gresford's ventilation system was undersized for current production levels. When the mine had opened in 1908, production was approximately 800 tons per day. By 1934, production had increased to 1,500 tons per day, but ventilation hadn't been proportionally increased. The result was predictable. As more coal was extracted, more methane was released, but the same ventilation system was expected to handle twice the gas load. Technical experts testified that the coal dust accumulation violated best practices. While not technically illegal, 1934 regulations didn't mandate stone dusting in all circumstances. The accumulated dust created conditions where any methane ignition could trigger a devastating secondary explosion. Perhaps most damning was testimony from William Jethro, one of the 6 survivors. He testified that he'd phoned the surface at approximately 1:45 a.m. 23 minutes before the explosion, reporting dangerous gas readings in his section. He'd asked for authorization to evacuate his crew. According to Jethro, night supervisor Thomas Carlyle had told him to monitor the situation but hadn't authorized evacuation or shutdown. Carlyle denied this. He testified that he'd received no such call, but his log showed no record of gas warnings between midnight and the explosion. Either Jethro was misremembering, or Carlyle hadn't logged the call, or one of them was lying. The inquiry couldn't resolve this contradiction. No recording of the phone call existed. No other witnesses had heard Jethro make the call or Carlyle receive it. It came down to credibility. A working miner who'd survived by luck versus a supervisor who'd been on the surface during the explosion. The inquiry's final report, issued in March 1935, was carefully worded. It concluded the explosion at Gresford Colliery resulted from ignition of methane gas leading to a coal dust explosion of exceptional violence. Contributing factors included inadequate ventilation relative to current production levels, accumulation of coal dust, and insufficient gas monitoring in the hours immediately preceding the explosion. While the colliery management followed existing regulatory requirements, those requirements were inadequate to ensure safety under the conditions present at Gresford. The report stopped short of assigning criminal negligence. It noted that Walker had received warnings but argued that the warnings hadn't indicated imminent danger sufficient to mandate immediate shutdown. The report recommended improved ventilation standards, mandatory stone dusting, more frequent gas monitoring, and better breathing apparatus for rescue workers. But it assigned no blame. No criminal charges were filed, no one was held legally responsible for 266 deaths. The families of the dead received compensation, £300 per fatality under the Workmen's Compensation Act, £300. Barely 6 months' wages for a skilled miner. Widows received small pensions, £1 per week for herself, plus 10 shillings per child. Margaret Thomas, widow of David Thomas, whose spark had ignited the disaster, received £1 and 15 shillings per week to support herself and her 3 children. It wasn't enough to survive on. She found work as a laundress, took in boarders, and struggled into poverty. Mary Bonsall, who'd lost both her husband William and son John, received £600 total, £300 per death. It lasted less than 2 years. She exhausted her savings, sold her house, moved into a one-room flat, and survived on charity until her death in 1952, bitter and broken. The Gresford disaster had one unique and tragic characteristic: the bodies were never recovered. Unlike second-deadliest or other mining disasters where bodies were retrieved and families could hold funerals and bury their dead, Gresford's 255 entombed miners remain underground to this day. The sealed sections of the mine became a mass grave, the largest industrial tomb in British history. This created particular psychological trauma for survivors and families. Without bodies, without funerals, without physical graves to visit, grief had no outlet. Wives couldn't truly accept widowhood. Children couldn't process that fathers were really gone. The missing dead became ghosts haunting Wrexham for generations. In 1982, a memorial was erected at the site, a steel sculpture depicting a miner, a rescue worker, and a widow. The names of all 266 victims are inscribed on a stone wall. Every year on September 22, a memorial service is held. Fewer people attend each year. The survivors are gone now. Most widows have died, even children of the disaster are elderly. But the service continues, keeping alive the memory of 266 men who descended into darkness one September night and never returned. The Gresford disaster changed British mining regulations, but slowly and incrementally, ventilation standards were improved. Gas monitoring became more rigorous. Stone dusting became mandatory. Breathing apparatus for rescue workers was upgraded. These changes saved lives. Mining deaths decreased significantly in subsequent decades. But the fundamental dynamic that caused Gresford, production pressure overriding safety concerns, warnings dismissed or delayed, profit prioritized over human life, never entirely disappeared. Mining remained dangerous. Disasters continued, though less frequently, and with lower death tolls. John Davies, the deputy overman whose warnings were ignored, never worked underground again. He took a surface job at a different colliery, earning less money but unable to face the darkness where 260 men had died because his warnings weren't heeded. He testified at the inquiry, provided his documentation, watched the panel conclude that no one was to blame. He died in 1951, age 64, still carrying guilt for deaths that weren't his fault. Sir Henry Walker, the colliery manager, faced no legal consequences. He resigned from Gresford in 1935, but immediately found another management position at a colliery in Yorkshire. He worked in mining until his retirement in 1955, dying in 1968 at age 82, comfortable and respected. His obituary mentioned his long career in mine management without referencing Gresford. The United Westminster and Wrexham Collieries Company continued operating. The accessible portions of Gresford Colliery reopened in 1936. Workers descended back into the mine, worked the same seams, past the sealed concrete barriers behind which 255 of their former co-workers remained entombed. The mine operated until 1973, when it closed due to declining coal reserves. Today the site is largely abandoned, the pithead buildings were demolished, the shaft was filled and capped. The memorial stands in a small park, the sealed tunnels remain beneath, holding their dead, a tomb that will last geologically, until the rock itself erodes away in millions of years. The bodies of 255 Welsh miners will remain where they fell. The Gresford disaster remains Britain's second-deadliest mining accident, after Cremated, but what makes Gresford uniquely tragic isn't just the death toll, it's the documentation. John Davies' written warnings filed 3 days before the disaster predicted exactly what would happen. The explosion wasn't unforeseeable, it was foreseen, documented in writing, reported to management, and ignored. That documentation makes Gresford a perfect case study in industrial negligence, not the spectacular negligence of owners who deliberately endanger workers, but the banal negligence of managers who receive warnings, acknowledge them, and defer action because production schedules don't accommodate safety improvements. The Gresford Memorial at Gresford, near Wrexham, a steel sculpture stands in a small memorial park. 3 figures, a miner with his lamp, a rescue worker with breathing apparatus, a widow with head bowed. Behind them, a stone wall lists 266 names in alphabetical order. The memorial was unveiled in 1982, 48 years after the disaster. At the base of the memorial is a plaque bearing words from John Davies' September 19, 1934 report, the first of his 3 ignored warnings: dangerous levels of methane detected in Dennis section, immediate ventilation improvements required. Continued work under present conditions presents significant risk of explosion. Below that, a single sentence from colliery manager Sir Henry Walker's response, report noted. Ventilation improvements scheduled for next maintenance period. Continue monitoring. The Gresford disaster began as a deputy's warning about gas accumulation, transformed into an explosion that killed 266 miners in 4 seconds, and ended as 255 bodies sealed forever underground, because recovering them would risk more lives. Managers who had dismissed warnings as production-disrupting alarmism watched as those warnings materialized into Britain's second-worst mining catastrophe, where ignored methane reports measured against next maintenance period. Scheduling resulted in fathers and sons dying together, families destroyed, and an entire community economically devastated. John Davies had warned in writing 3 days before the explosion. William Jethro had phoned warnings 23 minutes before ignition. Both warnings were acknowledged and dismissed. By September 23, 1934, those warnings had proven prophetic, production schedules had become irrelevant, and 266 Welsh miners remained underground, 6 pulled from accessible tunnels for burial, 11 recovered days later, 255 sealed behind concrete barriers to remain entombed until the rock itself erodes away. Part 2. The days following the sealing decision were unlike anything Wrexham had experienced. The town entered collective mourning, not just for the dead, but for the loss of their bodies, the impossibility of proper burial, the knowledge that fathers and sons and brothers would remain forever in darkness beneath their feet. Churches held memorial services without bodies present, empty coffins were carried in funeral processions, graveyards received headstones marking graves that contained no remains, symbolic burials for men whose bodies lay under tons of rock and coal, sealed behind concrete barriers 2 miles underground. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Mining communities had long experience with death, mining was dangerous, accidents happened, families buried their dead and moved on, but Gresford was different. Without bodies, grief couldn't find closure. Widows reported seeing their dead husbands in crowds, hearing familiar footsteps, setting places at dinner tables for men who would never return. Children suffered particularly. Young children couldn't comprehend death without seeing a body, without attending a funeral, without visiting a grave. They waited for fathers to come home, asked when daddy would return from the mine, couldn't understand adult explanations about explosions and sealed tunnels. Thomas Bonsall, age 7, son of John Bonsall who died alongside his grandfather William, refused to believe his father was dead. For 3 years he waited at the window each evening around the time his father's shift would have ended, watching for him to walk up the street. His mother Mary couldn't bear to tell him to stop. Eventually he grew old enough to understand, but the damage was done. He struggled with attachment and abandonment issues his entire life, never married, died at age 53, having spent his life unable to form close relationships after watching that window for 3 years. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. 266 wage earners lost meant approximately £3,000 per week in lost wages, over £150,000 annually, from a town of 30,000 people. Shops closed, banks foreclosed on mortgages, families moved away seeking work elsewhere. Wrexham's population declined by nearly 3,000 people between 1934 and 1940, a direct result of the disaster's economic destruction. The compensation provided by law was grossly inadequate. Widows received £1 per week plus 10 shillings per child under age 16. A widow with 3 children received £2.50 per week, barely enough for food, let alone rent, clothing, fuel, and other necessities. Many widows faced immediate poverty. Those who'd been buying homes on mortgage lost them. Those who rented faced eviction when they couldn't pay. Women who'd never worked outside the home suddenly needed income. But employment options for working-class women in 1934 Wrexham were limited: domestic service, laundry work, sewing, low-paid, physically demanding work. Women took whatever they could find, often working multiple jobs while raising children alone. The disaster created an entire generation of fatherless children, more than 500 children who lost fathers in a single night. Studies tracking these children found significantly higher rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, and more psychological problems compared to peers from intact families. The disaster's effects echoed through generations. Among the 6 survivors, guilt was overwhelming and permanent. They'd lived while 260 others died. Often the difference was mere yards being assigned to one section instead of another, pure chance. Several survivors developed severe depression. 2 committed suicide within 5 years of the disaster, unable to reconcile survival with guilt over the dead. William Jethro, the deputy who claimed he'd phoned warnings to the surface 23 minutes before the explosion, was particularly haunted. His testimony at the inquiry had been dismissed, characterized as misremembering under trauma, or worse, fabricating to deflect blame. He knew what he'd reported. He knew he'd been told to monitor rather than evacuate, and 260 men had died. He drank heavily, lost multiple jobs, died in 1949 at age 47 from liver failure, effectively a delayed casualty of Gresford. The political response to Gresford was muted compared to earlier disasters like second-deadliest. By 1934, Britain had comprehensive mine safety legislation. The problem wasn't lack of laws but inadequate enforcement and regulations written to balance safety against production efficiency. Gresford exposed that balance as fundamentally flawed, but changing it required confronting powerful mining interests that employed hundreds of thousands and supplied coal essential to British industry. The 1935 inquiry recommendations were implemented slowly. Improved ventilation standards became mandatory, but with 5-year grace periods for existing mines to comply. Stone dusting requirements were strengthened, but enforcement remained inconsistent. Gas monitoring was enhanced, but deputies still lacked authority to shut down operations without management approval. The fundamental power dynamic remained unchanged. Production managers controlled operations, safety deputies could warn but not enforce, and economic pressure consistently pushed toward accepting higher risks to maintain output. This dynamic continued producing disasters. In 1947, an explosion at William Pit in Yorkshire killed 104 miners. Inadequate ventilation and accumulated gas, essentially the same causes as Gresford. In 1951, the Easington Colliery disaster killed 81 miners, again gas explosion in poorly ventilated sections. In 1960, Six Bells Colliery explosion killed 45 miners, same pattern, same causes, different location. Each disaster prompted renewed calls for reform, each produced incremental improvements. But the basic tension, production versus safety, profit versus human life, persisted until British coal mining itself declined into irrelevance. The Gresford disaster had one lasting cultural impact. It inspired one of the most famous mining ballads, the Gresford Disaster, written by folk singer Idris Davies shortly after the explosion. The song's haunting verses captured the tragedy's essence. You've heard of the Gresford disaster, the terrible price that was paid. 262 colliers were lost, and 3 men of a rescue brigade. The song became an anthem in mining communities, sung at memorials, union meetings and protests. It kept Gresford's memory alive when official history might have forgotten it. Even today, Welsh male voice choirs perform the Gresford disaster at memorial services, ensuring each generation knows the names and the price. The United Westminster and Wrexham Collieries Company faced minimal consequences. The inquiry assigned no criminal liability. Civil compensation was mandated by law but capped at £300 per death. The company paid approximately £79,800 in death compensation, significant but not crippling. Insurance covered most of it. The company continued operating profitably. In 1947, the British coal industry was nationalised, and United Westminster and Wrexham Collieries became part of the National Coal Board. The company's directors received generous compensation for their shares. The nationalisation was presented as a way to prioritise worker safety over private profit. Whether it actually achieved that goal remains debated. Nationalised mines still faced production pressure, still had gas explosions, still killed miners when safety was compromised for output. The Gresford site itself remained active until 1973. Miners continued working there, extracting coal from sections adjacent to the sealed areas where 255 of their predecessors remained entombed. Walking past the concrete barriers that sealed off the Dennis and Martin sections became routine, a daily reminder that beneath their feet lay the largest industrial tomb in British history. When the mine finally closed in 1973, due to exhausted reserves rather than safety concerns, the entire complex was decommissioned. The shaft was filled with concrete and debris, permanently sealing it. The pit head buildings were demolished. The site was cleared. Nothing remains except the memorial park and the sealed tunnels beneath. Those tunnels will remain sealed forever. The concrete barriers will last centuries. The rock surrounding the entombed sections is stable, no risk of collapse or gas escape. 255 miners will remain where they fell until geological time erases the tunnels themselves, perhaps in millions of years, as tectonic forces reshape the earth. This permanence gives Gresford a unique place in mining history. Other disasters killed more people, but the dead were recovered and buried. Gresford's dead remain in situ, in the workplace where they died, surrounded by the tools and machinery they were operating when the explosion occurred. It's a time capsule of industrial death, preserved perfectly in the darkness, unchanging, eternal. For families of the entombed, this created complex emotions. Some found comfort in the idea that their loved ones remained together, in the place they'd worked, rather than scattered in individual graves. Others found it horrifying, the thought of bodies decaying in darkness, unreachable, unable to receive Christian burial and consecration. Religious leaders struggled with theological questions. Could men buried in unconsecrated ground enter heaven? Were souls of the entombed trapped underground, unable to ascend? These questions sound medieval to modern ears, but they were real and agonizing for devout mining families in 1934 Wales. Most churches eventually concluded that consecration wasn't necessary for salvation, that God's mercy extended to those who died suddenly and remained unburied through no fault of their own. But the theological uncertainty added to families' distress. Their loved ones weren't just physically unreachable, but potentially spiritually endangered. The disaster's impact on John Davies, the deputy whose warnings were ignored, was particularly profound. He'd done everything right, detected the gas, reported it immediately, followed up repeatedly, documented everything in writing, and 260 men died anyway because management prioritized production schedules over his warnings. Davies testified at the inquiry with meticulous records, his inspection reports from September 19, 20th and 21st, showing progressive gas accumulation, his written requests for ventilation improvements, the responses he'd received deferring action, his final warning on September 21st, explicitly stating that continuing operations was criminally negligent. The inquiry reviewed this documentation, acknowledged its accuracy, and concluded that while Davies's concerns were reasonable, they hadn't indicated imminent danger sufficient to mandate immediate shutdown. The gas levels he'd reported were elevated, but not yet at concentrations requiring work stoppage under existing regulations. This legal distinction destroyed Davies. He'd reported danger. He'd been overruled. 260 men died, but legally, no one was culpable, because regulations didn't require action until gas reached higher concentrations. The law itself was inadequate, but inadequate laws aren't crimes. Davies left underground work immediately after the inquiry. He took a surface position at a different colliery, a significant pay cut, but he couldn't face the darkness anymore. He attended every memorial service at Gresford for 17 years until his death in 1951. He visited the memorial regularly, reading the names carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. His widow later said he never forgave himself, despite everyone telling him he'd done everything possible. He said if he'd been more forceful, more insistent, if he'd refused to leave the surface until they listened, maybe they'd have acted. I told him management would have just fired him and sent someone else down. He knew that intellectually, but emotionally he felt those 260 deaths were his failure. This illustrates a cruel reality of industrial disasters. The conscientious workers who follow procedures and report dangers often suffer the most guilt, while negligent managers who ignore warnings face minimal consequences and sleep soundly. Sir Henry Walker, the colliery manager who'd received Davies's warnings and deferred action, testified at the inquiry with no apparent remorse. He'd followed regulations. Production schedules required continuous operation. The warnings hadn't indicated imminent danger. The explosion was an unfortunate accident, not a foreseeable consequence of identifiable negligence. The inquiry essentially agreed. Walker faced no criminal charges, no professional sanctions, no civil liability beyond the company's mandated compensation payments. He resigned from Gresford in 1935, immediately found another management position, and continued a successful career. His conscience, if troubled, left no public record. This disparity, between John Davies carrying guilt until death and Sir Henry Walker continuing his career untroubled, captures the fundamental injustice of Gresford. The man who tried to prevent the disaster suffered for it. The man who could have prevented it but didn't, faced no consequences. The disaster's legacy in British mining was mixed. Safety regulations improved incrementally. Ventilation standards were strengthened. Gas monitoring became more rigorous. Enforcement was enhanced. These changes saved lives. British mining deaths declined significantly in subsequent decades. But the fundamental dynamic persisted. Mines remained gassy. Economic pressure pushed for maximum production. Managers balanced safety costs against production benefits. Warnings were assessed based on immediate crisis versus long-term risk, and occasionally that calculus failed, and miners died. The frequency decreased. The death tolls became smaller, but the pattern continued until British coal mining itself collapsed, not because it became too dangerous but because it became too expensive. North Sea oil, natural gas, nuclear power, and cheaper imported coal made British deep mining economically unviable. By the 1980s, the industry that had employed 1 million workers and powered an empire was dying. Margaret Thatcher's government accelerated the decline, closing unprofitable mines despite fierce resistance from mining communities. The 1984–85 miners' strike was the industry's death throes, a year-long battle that unions lost. By 2000, only a handful of deep mines remained operational. By 2015, the last deep coal mine in Britain closed. Today, British coal mining is history. The industry that shaped the nation for 2 centuries, that built fortunes and destroyed bodies, that powered industrialization and killed tens of thousands of workers, is gone. The mines are sealed, the pit villages are dying, the culture is fading. Gresford is remembered not just as a disaster but as a symbol of an entire era, when men descended into darkness daily to extract the fuel that powered civilization, when industrial production demanded human sacrifice, when warnings were written and ignored and proved prophetic in explosions that killed hundreds. The memorial at Gresford sees fewer visitors each year. The miners who worked there are all dead now. The widows have passed, even the children of victims are elderly. Soon there will be no one alive who remembers September 22, 1934, no one who waited at the pithead, no one who lost family, no one who carries personal memory of the disaster. But the sealed tunnels remain. 255 bodies in eternal darkness. The concrete barriers will last centuries after the last person who remembers them is gone. The memorial will stand decades after the last memorial service, and the names carved in stone will remain readable long after anyone alive knows why they're there. This is Gresford's final irony: the men buried in that darkness will outlast the memory of their deaths. The tomb will outlast the mourners, the physical evidence will persist long after the disaster's meaning fades. In 2034, the centennial of the disaster, a special memorial service was planned. Historians would speak, Welsh choirs would sing the Gresford Disaster. Descendants of victims would attend, the names would be read aloud, all 266, taking approximately 15 minutes, then silence for 4 seconds. The length of the explosion, and then everyone would go home, return to lives unconnected to mining, in a Britain where coal is history, and the idea of men descending 2,000 feet to hack rock by lamplight seems impossibly distant and ancient. But beneath Wrexham, in sealed tunnels that will last geologically, 255 Welsh miners remain where they fell in 1934, surrounded by the tools they were using, positioned at the coal face where they were working, frozen in the moment of their deaths, some killed instantly by overpressure, others burned by flames, others overcome by gas, all entombed together in the workplace that killed them. They are not forgotten, exactly. The memorial exists. The song is sung, the history is recorded, but they are fading, slipping from living memory into historical record, from personal tragedy into academic study, from grief into data. John Davies' September 19 warning remains archived: dangerous levels of methane detected in Dennis section, immediate ventilation improvements required. Continued work under present conditions presents significant risk of explosion. 7 words in that report proved prophetic: significant risk of explosion. 3 days later, that risk materialized: 4 seconds of explosion, 266 deaths, 255 bodies sealed forever underground. Sir Henry Walker's response remains archived too. Report noted: ventilation improvements scheduled for next maintenance period, continue monitoring. The maintenance period was scheduled for October 1934. The explosion occurred September 22. The next maintenance period never came, because there was no mine left to maintain, only sealed tunnels and a mass grave. The Gresford disaster remains Britain's most documented preventable industrial catastrophe. Unlike second-deadliest, where warnings existed but weren't explicitly predictive, Gresford's paper trail is unambiguous. John Davies predicted the disaster in writing. Management acknowledged his warning. Management chose not to act. The disaster occurred exactly as predicted. This documentation makes Gresford legally frustrating and morally clear. Legally, no crime occurred. Management followed existing regulations which didn't require immediate action for the gas levels Davies reported. Morally, 266 men died because warnings were dismissed in favor of production schedules. The law eventually changed. Post-Gresford regulations gave deputies authority to stop work based on their judgment, not just measured gas levels. This change came too late for the 266 dead, but prevented future disasters. It's cold comfort, reform written in blood, safety purchased with corpses, progress measured in lives that could have been saved. The final count at Gresford was 266 dead, 262 miners, 3 rescue workers who died attempting to reach survivors, and 1 surface worker killed by the explosion's pressure wave. The breakdown by location: 140 in the Dennis section sealed and never recovered, 87 in the Martin section also sealed, 28 in connecting tunnels, 11 of whom were recovered, 6 survivors. The arithmetic is simple and devastating. 272 men descended, 6 returned alive. 266 died. 255 remain underground. 11 were recovered and buried properly. The rest are entombed forever, 2,000 feet below Wrexham, in darkness that will last geologically. They were husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. They were William and John Bonsall, working together, dying together. David Thomas, whose coal-cutting machine sparked the ignition. John Hughes, Methodist minister and miner, who'd preached that morning about God's protection. Thomas Williams, who'd survived Second-deadliest in 1913 only to die at Gresford in 1934. Robert Davies, 19 years old, engaged to be married the following month. 266 names. 266 stories. 266 lives ended in 4 seconds because methane accumulated in poorly ventilated tunnels, because warnings were dismissed, because production mattered more than prophecies of disaster. The explosion at Gresford lasted 4 seconds. The rescue effort lasted 4 days. The inquiry lasted 47 days. The legal consequences lasted 0 days. No criminal charges, no liability beyond mandated compensation, no accountability for negligence that killed 266 men. But the memory, imperfect, fading but persistent, has lasted 90 years and counting. As long as the memorial stands, as long as the Gresford disaster is sung, as long as historians write about mining safety and industrial negligence, Gresford will be remembered as the disaster that was predicted, documented, and ignored until prediction became reality and 266 Welsh miners paid for that negligence with their lives.